If you're going to be a Christian working in politics, you're going to have to maintain your moral character, which means you're going to have to work harder than anyone else because you can't do moral shortcuts. And I believe that the Christian, as it relates to politics, should not at all be nice. What we should do is undertake God's commanded characteristic of kindness.
Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. I'm here this week with Jim Pfaff from Against Nice podcast. So welcome, Jim, and it's great to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I'm here in Colorado. Good to connect with Northern Ireland.
Absolutely.
Lots of wonderful things to discuss, I think.
Yeah, hopefully you can come visit sometime and I'll show you around the place and get you acquainted with Belfast.
I will be very judicious in when I am wearing orange.
Absolutely. Depends where you are.
Right. Yeah, we're kind of jumping across the pond together, it looks like here.
Transatlantic. And I mean, I guess a lot of my podcasts tend to be that way because there are obviously opinionated people from the UK, but I guess you tend to find that people maybe are more strong in their convictions a lot of time, or a lot more open and public with their beliefs and views in the US kind of culture. So I think in the UK we're maybe a little more. That's I guess where the podcast came from and the website. It's from kind of encouraging people to be open with talking about their religious and political beliefs and just putting it out there and for the sake of having a healthy discussion and just opening up this dialogue.
Yeah. By the way, in the UK as well, you guys are there's even more reticence, as I think you're referring to here, to talking about religion and politics.
I think so.
Than you would see in the United States.
Yeah, well, the evangelical side of things in the US is very unashamedly, I guess, pro Donald Trump, pro Republican Party, and very pro life. It's all very clear where they stand, and you know it's interesting maybe to hear from your perspective on this, because I think in the UK, like I said, people just don't want to put it out there because I guess it's a fear of maybe driving people away that aren't quite on the same page as you. Maybe if you go out and you can alienate some people from being overly political with your faith, and I guess I can see where the issue could be there. But I guess from your perspective, do you see in the US that people are more out there and just open with what they believe?
There's no doubt. I think historically it's kind of interesting because I would say we were in this regard a lot more like the UK until about the mid part of the 20th century. Jerry Falwell started the moral majority. And, I was born in 65 and I became a teenager, obviously, in the late 70s, early 80s. I started being very concerned about what was going on. I was very enamored of Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And both in 76, actually, it's kind of funny. I was 11 years old in 1976 when he lost the nomination to Gerald Ford that year, and I was in tears. Right. I still remember it. I don't know how fully I really understood everything there, but I did have a great admiration and respect of Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And that kind of sparked my interest in politics. And I'm sharing this because at the same time that that's happening to me, Jerry Falwell's effort, which began roughly in 1978, I think he started envisioning it as far back as the 76 presidential elections. He felt very strongly that American Christians needed to be much more engaged in what was going on in politics. We had the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, which forced legalized abortion in the United States. We actually had legal abortion prior to that, but on a state-by-state basis.
Exactly.
In fact, I live here in Colorado. We were the first state to legalize abortion, and we legalized it all the way up to term. Right out the gate.
Yeah.
And we've been that way ever since. That was 1960 that happened. Okay. We actually have something on the ballot here this year, which would restrict abortion to 22 weeks, from 22 weeks and after. Mm-hmm. So this might be the very first real restriction on abortion we've had since this whole debate started.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I mean, to me, it's an increasing pattern, I guess, in the US, where it seems like this whole idea of states' rights is almost like people think of it as almost primitive, or maybe it's a kind of mean-spirited idea where if you say about about leaving something to the states, people assume it means that you aren't willing to have you don't have a full support of these issues that they talk about, like abortion and even when you talk about things like gay marriage and things like that. If you say leave it to the states, people think, oh, you're just being mean because you don't want to get fully behind the agenda. You know what I mean? So to me it makes much more sense to leave it to the states because there's such a broad range of just viewpoints and cultures even within the US. With 50 states, and some of them are just they could be different countries. They're that different. Some are maybe more similar to a European country in terms of their social views, and then some are very conservative. So I just think that these sort of things, and even you saw it with Obamacare, those sort of things don't really work on a federal level because of the depth and breadth of different viewpoints, and it's just an increasing pattern. I think that this idea of leaving things at the states is kind of being neglected a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the way this whole federal versus state concept, which really is an American ideal, not entirely, but in many ways.
Yeah.
Geographically, we're so large as a country. Well, first of all, the concept started because of an understanding that we had these various states that formed out of the various compacts that were made with our home country, England, obviously, and they each developed their own character.
Yeah.
And when the Constitution was written, there was felt, and I think rightly so, a need to say, let each of these states, since we're going to join in a union, let each of these states maintain their own character.
Yep.
And it kind of becomes a factory of ideas. And when you allow states to determine how they're going to do things, and we did it in a less antagonistic way. So, for example, the hatred between England and Scotland, which goes back centuries, and has such a mix of political components to it that we never experienced in this country. It actually works well, and even to this day, you think about it, it's a lot more toned down. You still have these long histories that people in Great Britain feel, nationally, so to speak, but yet it's kind of toned down quite a bit. There's more unanimity in Great Britain than there ever. I mean, just Northern Ireland, where you are, just look at the changes that have happened there.
The devolution of powers back to the individual. I guess it's a semi-federal system where it's I mean, you couldn't really compare it to the American system, I think, because I guess there's no concept of any unenumerated things remain with the states, that kind of stuff. It's more like the crown is the one that has the ultimate sovereignty really over all of them. But I guess this idea of like devolution is our term really for giving these things back to the individual countries and nations within the UK. We've seen things like policing in Northern Ireland being devolved, and that's a huge step forward because then we had the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and whenever we got the police service of Northern Ireland, then I guess people from both sides were able to feel this ownership of this policing. It's not just the British state against Irish people or anything like that. It's a community police service that we can own, and it's the same with even in the coronavirus restrictions. Each individual part of the UK is different in that regard, because in Wales, I think they've completely shut down the big kind of supermarkets from being able to retail non-essential items in order to force people, like, for example, say our version of Walmart, really, Tesco's, they would have greetings cards or books, things like that in the store. They have to put these kind of barriers over them to force people to kind of go to independent bookshops to buy these things, because in order to get the footfall on the high street. So it's that isn't something that's been implemented all over the UK, but we've seen these differences in restrictions, and sometimes it can get messy. But I guess that's the same as in America when we've seen with the whole coronavirus response. Maybe the president hasn't been quite as open about saying, we're not your overlords. Each state has their role to play and their own restrictions that they're going to have to enforce. But that confuses things, because then people look to the head of the president and say, you need to be doing more. But, maybe he needed to articulate better that it's not my place to do more. Each state has their own part to play. So.
Yeah. I think some people have been critical of Trump having a light hand, but to be candid, he's acted in a truly constitutional manner.
Yes, I think
in that regard. And I think it's been actually quite helpful. He's getting a lot of criticism from his opponent, Joe Biden, and Democrats. But at the same time, we're starting to see politically that I think right at the beginning, back in March and late February, March, when we started to see that, this is going to be a little bit of a problem. I think it's very fair to say that every state, whether it had a Democrat or a Republican governor, was just trying to be cautious.
Yes.
We saw what was happening in Italy and how outrageous their situation had gotten because their hospitals were truly overwhelmed and people were actually dying because they couldn't get care.
Absolutely.
And we wanted to avoid that. Totally appropriate. At some point, though, and this is the way American politics has devolved, in my opinion, Democrat governors in particular started saying, hey, look, this economy is going nuts. That's going to totally hurt Donald Trump in an election year. Let's keep him closed. I literally believe that's part of the motivation. We have a Democrat governor here in Colorado with whom I actually have a good relationship, although he's a Democrat. I'm a Republican. Jared Polis. He's the first homosexual governor in this country, at least that's out as a homosexual. And he's been highly restrictive too. I've been quite frustrated, but I'm convinced that he and other Democrats are thinking, listen, this is hurting Trump, because you hear it in the rhetoric. You hear Democrats and Joe Biden and some of these talking about, listen, we're going to get rid of this coronavirus thing if you elect us. Yeah. Basically, what they're saying is we're going to lock you down until we can win and have it our way.
This is the thing that confused me most about the debates, and I think there were some kind of ads put out by the Biden side that were saying, this is Donald Trump's economy. This crash is all Donald Trump. And it doesn't make sense to me, because I think if Donald Trump had his way, there probably wouldn't have been very many lockdowns anywhere at all. So this whole thing, I don't really know who they're trying to pull the wool over their eyes, because it doesn't really make sense. How can Donald Trump be blamed for lockdowns and coronavirus restrictions? Maybe their point is that's more that's been allowed to go on for too long. And I've heard people like Brett Weinstein kind of advocating. He said we should have from the very start locked everything totally down, almost like New Zealand style, where everything was restricted nationally for a couple of weeks or even a month, and then from there on, until it was eliminated, completely gone. But I don't know if there's ever, that doesn't necessarily get rid of any risk of it coming back in, and it's just it'll be a huge step for a country the size of the US to completely lock down the whole country. So there's obviously a middle ground where people want to be, but in order to say that Donald Trump was really the one that was responsible for this economy going downhill is kind of a huge fallacy. Plus, we've also then, of course, the coronavirus help package the Congress are trying to pass as well. Nancy Pelosi's out blaming the Republicans are out blaming the Democrats for not compromising, but really I think that in particular, even more so than the idea of solving the whole coronavirus thing like Joe Biden claims he can do, but I think that the help package kind of is the main way that the Democrats have just been completely unwilling to do anything that would give Donald Trump a bit of a boost or a bit of credit for it, because it would, no matter what, he has to sign it at the end of the day, even if they author it. So that was the main way that I saw this kind of spiteful approach, maybe where they're holding back on giving help to people, just in order to stay away from giving Trump any kind of reason to celebrate.
Yeah, listen, this has been, and I think it's happened to a certain degree in England and UK and parts of Europe, but it's really bad here in the United States, where it's the us and them approach. Yes. Of course, we are a two-party system. I think we tend to get it worse when you get to this place where we're at, where each party is like all-out war with one another, and all the marbles are on the line. You get into parliamentary systems where you have multi-party efforts. Yep. You still are restrained, even though it gets to that place, you're still restrained from it somewhat, because you have to build these coalitions with the minor parties. We see that effect in the United States, by the way. I worked in Washington, D.C. as a chief of staff for a couple of different congressmen, and my guys were these more libertarian-minded, limited government types that didn't go along, and I did it as a Republican, that didn't go along with the Republican establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to try to build from time to time coalitions
Right.
with us. It doesn't work in quite the same way, but it's similar.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the two-party system has put everybody at odds. And my concern is that we're moving towards, in this country, towards the constitutionalist party, even though I don't think they're very constitutional sometimes, the Republicans, and the anti-constitutionalist party, the Democrats. There was actually an article written in not the Atlantic, but one of the other more left-leaning publications, where they've made the argument during this campaign season that we need to replace our Constitution or get rid of it entirely and work apart from that. That's where we've gone, and so all the marbles are there,
thrown up in the air really in this season.
It's been crazy, but
I mean,
that's been our real challenge.
You mentioned this kind of multi-party system, and it's an approach that we have taken in Northern Ireland in order to, like you said, build these kind of coalitions. But the issue with our system is it's almost, I mean, you may laugh at this, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but it's forcing the two opposing parties who are completely opposed with everything, they are forced to share power in order to work together for both sides of the community. And some people might think that's not a bad idea because they have to find the compromise somewhere, but you get this unbelievable gridlock, and even worse than the US system, where, I mean, what tends to happen here is because it's a compulsory, like a forced coalition, then if one side doesn't get their way, then they resign from the executive, and then the whole thing falls apart for another year or so until they try to figure out how to put it all back together. So this we have this we've seen so many sort of horrible situations where things can't get done, and if someone's to blame, they'll just resign, and then nothing. The whole legislative part of that all falls apart as well because they can't run without the executive side. So I don't know if multi-party systems are really what you want to strive for. I understand some kind of more representative system, maybe, where I know New Zealand have, I think they do like a percentage where people will they'll vote on who they want to be in power, and then there's a list of candidates, and the list of people are assigned based on the percentage of the popular vote. And there's merit to those kind of systems, but people sort of underestimate, I think, the sheer gridlock that results from no strong and of course the US system isn't designed to have necessarily strong leadership from any of the three branches at all. Obviously the courts won't, but they're not designed to have a strong presidency or a strong legislature. It's designed to be the checks and balances, and things can't move forward unless there is some kind of a compromise and working together. But it takes it to another level when you end up with these minorities that are actually in power. You might have, say there was more support for the Greens and Libertarians, and under this kind of system, maybe they have 10-15% each in Congress, and then the Republicans are running the place with 30% and the Dems are picking up the rest. You get that kind of system where it's nobody can make these deals, and even with the increased polarization of society, you wonder, would they ever be able to make deals, especially in America? So
right. Well, and election rules are set state by state here. And it has worked out that those rules favor a two-party system. It is very hard for outlying parties. In this case, the two strongest in recent years have been the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. Libertarian Party being more successful.
Yeah,
but they can't get proper placement on the ballot to make a difference. We've set it up that way, and I think I have some concerns with that. But we've also had a bit of stability. But when you look at like what happened in Israel recently in these Knesset votes,
right,
and what Netanyahu had to go through this last time just to gain power, you can see where those systems can really break down. But in both cases, it's freedom. I mean, we've got people that can vote. They can align with people they agree with, and they can relatively have an opportunity to voice their opinion. I mean, you just look at the parties in Great Britain. I mean, it really is, Labor and Conservatives, but these other parties beneath every government that is put together and every opposition government that's put together, they must listen to their factions.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier in a two-party system to shut those factions down.
Well, the whole
I saw one of my bosses get kicked off of all of his committees in
Oh, right,
Congress
okay.
because he wouldn't go with the party line.
Yeah.
That's less easy to do in a parliamentary system.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's the carrot and the stick as well in the parliamentary system as well, where we saw this with all. It's similar. We're seeing this in almost every sort of Western political system where, in recent years, there's been a kind of reckoning where the wheels have come off in different ways, and people have had to sort of evaluate how things are done. So, in the UK, Brexit was that sort of spanner in the works, and that exposed a lot of constitutional kind of loopholes and things that weren't, became very obvious and rose to the surface. So, for example, Theresa May had, I guess, she had a government that was able to get into power after their second election by making this coalition with the Northern Irish Unionist Party, the DUP, and of course she had to listen to them and try and keep them on board to try and push some kind of legislation through. But the biggest opposition was within her own party. There was this block of maybe 20 to 25 people who were just totally holding out against any kind of a Brexit deal, and sort of despite what their manifesto pledged in order to get Brexit done, that was what the manifesto said, and that is quite vague. But the issue there was really it got to the stage where we were all waiting for an election to happen because nothing could get done. So the Conservatives got their new leader, and then the Conservatives were ready for an election because they felt it was possible to win it, despite the Brexit party looming in the background. Labour didn't want to do that because they knew they would get kicked. Really, they would just get destroyed in the elections. They knew that was coming, so they didn't want to do that. And then this game came. It was played where Boris Johnson was saying, right, well, they're the wimps, they don't want an election, we're ready for it. And then of course everyone instantly was, oh no, we're for an election, let's have it. So but you got to see the what I'm trying to say then is that this faction of people that were holding out, the threat to them was that they obviously weren't selected to run in the next election, so they lost their seats, lost their jobs. It's happened. You can very easily hold that threat of well, you can sort of ruin things this time, but next time, there's not a chance you're gonna be put forward. So there is some kind of there's a much stronger whip system where party discipline here is extremely strong compared to even the US system. Obviously, there's the same thing where there's threats. You'll know yourself being in Congress, but our whip system, I believe, is considerably stronger than the American system. But the parliamentary system it's sort of what people might say is its downfall is that the fact that the legislature is the executive. Really, it's made up from the people in the legislature. So really, if there's no power, if there's no majority in this legislative body, absolutely nothing can get done whatsoever. Because there's no distinction.
And by the way, I think it also for the people who don't understand how parliamentary systems work, it makes you realize what a force of nature Winston Churchill was, because he was literally going against his own party.
Yep.
And the whip system was as stronger then as it is now, and yet he was calling him out, and he should have been done. And just because of his lineage and his past political career, having been part of the government, it was not enough. He could still have gotten totally chucked.
Yep.
That kind of courage, I think, sometimes is not well understood in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Boris Johnson at the minute, I guess people could chalk it down to charisma, but he is sort of taken a party. The Conservative Party was ruined. It looked like it may never get elected again if they didn't make a move. But somehow, through his charisma, he's managed to bring people together from the kind of Remain and Brexit sides and kind of start. For some reason, they've kind of been able to rally behind the personality, and that's something that very quickly rises to the top in the UK system, where the personalities will quickly, people who are able to lead will become very apparent. Whereas, I don't know, maybe the presidential system should be like that, but when people like Joe Biden are able to rise to the top, then you wonder, what's the kind of how do people prove themselves in order to be worthy of the nomination? And I don't know, when it gets to the stage where you can put forward someone who's just not Donald Trump, then just based on that, then you wonder, what is that any qualification at all to, or any standard to hold someone to? And
I think we'll maybe get into this it's actually interesting because Trump is a bit Churchillian in his rise through a totally different system. I mean, it's a different type of rise, but it's this anomaly, this force of nature that comes in there. I'm curious though, what would you say are people in Great Britain and in Europe in general? What do they really think about Donald Trump, in your opinion?
I I know very few people who would be willing, I mean, percentage wise, willing to stand by Donald Trump and say that they support him. I found this at our wedding. My wife's from Florida, so there was obviously a lot of mixing of people from my side of things and Heather's side, and people had these conversations. Everyone would come up and say to people in her family or Americans that were there, what do you think of Donald Trump? What do you really think of him? Like, isn't it just crazy what's going on? And then people might not like the replies they get. Maybe some of the responses were, well, maybe I like Donald Trump. Have you got a problem with that? So I don't know. I didn't hear those conversations, but really that's the sort of thing that would go on if anyone's talking to American. The first thing that'll come out is, what do you think of Donald Trump? How did he get in? Isn't it crazy what he's doing? Isn't he nuts? But they don't realize that there is this level of support in America that they maybe don't comprehend, that there's a lot of people that do support him and maybe think, he is a bit nuts at times. He's a bit crazy in his own way, but we like his policies. We like the way he's able to get things done. So it's something that people here definitely, I think the perception is that the people who support Trump are like the kind of uneducated Southern kind of rednecky type people who haven't a clue what they're talking about, but they don't understand the depth of actually, I guess, educated minds and thought that goes into supporting Donald Trump. So it's an interesting it's an interesting situation where really everyone just is looking in and thinking, how did that even happen?
What do Christians in Great Britain and Europe think about Donald Trump?
I think this is, again, one of the reasons why I started this podcast series, is that I think that the Christian perspective is almost entirely against the president. I started the podcast really to, I guess it was to highlight all sides of the argument, but really I felt like the conservative side maybe was very much underrepresented in common thought and in blogs and things that I've seen online, and I thought I really have to do something to give people a voice, not from all sides, especially, definitely from all sides, but especially the side that I didn't see being articulated that often or highlighted that often. So I think the Christians here are almost, I don't think it's unanimous, but I would say it's a vast majority would think that, I've said this before in my podcast, that people almost list off these things as the great terrible things in the world. Brexit's terrible, Donald Trump's terrible, all these things that are going on, they're just showing the downfall of the world almost. So yeah, there's not a lot of support, it's fair to say.
So you would say Christians in Great Britain are nearly unanimously opposed to Brexit, huh?
I think that it's maybe slightly less so than Donald Trump, but maybe from my experience, I can only talk from my experience, and I know Northern Ireland is more slightly more against Brexit than pro-Brexit, 55-45 kind of region, but I found that I was at a church event just the day after the Brexit vote, or the week after maybe, I think. I can't remember. Somehow I was able to vote, but then I was at an event that night or something like that, or the day after it all sort of came out. And I remember it was quite a large event. Someone got up to the front on stage and was kind of like, I know we're going to be hurting today. I know there's a lot of you are going to be emotional, not sure how to go forward with all this that's going on. I had to laugh to myself, because I thought, isn't it crazy that there's this assumption that everyone in the church is against it? And it's definitely driven a wedge between believers in some cases, I think, for sure, that there's just this assumption that, that everyone sort of falls in line under this one point of view. And Northern Ireland traditionally was the most conservative part of the UK, and definitely the most Christian, I guess you could say, most faith-based in terms of the culture. But nowadays it's very clear that I think the vast majority of Christians and Christian leaders particularly are very much against Donald Trump, Brexit, these kind of more conservative movements. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Now, by the way, well, before I get into that, I'm curious, what do these people think of Nigel Farage? When he comes over here and speaks on programming, he he touts a Christian perspective, which I think he's sincere about, obviously. So the perception for Americans would be, Christian Americans in particular, would be that Christians over in Great Britain would be a little bit more fiscally conservative in the Nigel Farage sort of way of thinking.
I think that's totally the opposite of what the case really is in my experience. Nigel Farage is almost universally thought of as a lunatic amongst most people. Despite the huge amount of popular support that there is for him, I think at least in the, I don't know, maybe the more, don't know how to articulate this well. People think it's more of a common person's movement again, kind of like people assume Donald Trump is the uneducated Southern person or that kind of stereotype. They think that Nigel Farage is supported by these kind of bigoted council estate kind of poor people that don't really understand what's going on in the world, and they're bigoted and these kind of things. So I personally think he's had a phenomenally bad and unfair, he's got just the media cover him really unfairly, and I know there's been some question over some of the people that have been involved in UKIP and some of their views, and people that have just, it attracts naturally, just as Donald Trump does in some ways, it attracts some more extreme elements. But I think Nigel Farage is very unfairly treated, and I think that, again, in the church, I don't think I've ever heard anyone on, at least in a position of authority, actually saying that Nigel Farage is anything but really a lunatic. So, now,
But you have kind of your evangelical wing of the church compared to your more traditionalist
it exists,
wing as well.
It exists. I think it's more...
Do you see a difference there between people that fall into those two camps?
Yeah, people in the comments may disagree, and I encourage, if anyone's listening to this podcast, drop a comment below if you do think I'm getting this wrong, because it's from my perspective. But I think that the more conservative side is almost... It's definitely it's more represented by the elderly, and that sort of thing is almost gradually fading away. Like the church would have been, we would have had a very, very strong and conservative church in even 30 years ago, with Ian Paisley being the leader here. He was first and foremost a Presbyterian leader and a church. He was a preacher. He would have said he was a preacher and a pastor before he was a politician, and that was his primary calling. But that would have sort of been what the church was like, really more firebrand preachers, very conservative points of view. But that's definitely, people have sought to leave that behind almost and move in more progressive ways, I think, to kind of shed that kind of reputation that the church did have. So nowadays I think that the more conservative side of things, they're a minority for sure among all demographics, but I think that the most of them would be older, more traditional churches, kind of the type of Church of Ireland and Presbyterian churches that maybe aren't either the type that would sing hymns on Sunday and wear their suits to church, that kind of thing, rather than the more I don't know how you would describe it in America, but we would call them, I guess you'd say, like spirit-filled churches, and those kind of more youthful and progressive type churches. So you wouldn't find too many people supporting Nigel Farage or Brexit or those things in these younger church congregations. But I mean,
and we're kind of
it's interesting. I was just gonna say it's interesting because I think it's very different. Obviously, you can maybe shine some light on this, that there's even churches like Bethel, which are huge and very popular here as well in terms of their music, but very much in support of the president. That's something that people might not really understand here. Do you want to even talk a little bit about your demographics and what it's like from in your...
Yeah, no, I think when it's interesting you bring up Bethel, which I'm definitely a very far right capitalist. I believe the Bible is capitalistic and it's not socialist, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go along here. But yet I come from a very traditionalist theological perspective. I come from a Reformed perspective. I would call myself an Augustinian, but that would also put me in the Calvinist camp, in the John Knox camp. I'm very probably can be described as Presbyterian in theology, even though I've never gone to a Presbyterian church in my life. So Bethel, you would find people in Bethel over in Redmond, Washington, very supportive of the president. By and large, you'd see some difference, but I mean, it would be a pretty strong majority pro Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the north side, Northern California is San Francisco, which is as far left and progressive as you can get. But North California, where Redmond, Washington is very conservative. So that's kind of consistent with the politics there. So that's interesting that
Yeah.
translates over into Great Britain, similar
Yeah.
political
Well,
outlook.
the music, people who are big fans of Bethel music probably would be baffled as to why they support Trump. That's what I would see here. I think if the music is very popular among churches, Bethel and Hillsong, those kind of churches,
Mm-hmm.
and Hillsong is slightly different. But Bethel, I think people might not be aware that they might actually be surprised to learn that they're so supportive of the president. I think people would be shocked almost if they actually did know that, but they don't always.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people are always aware. They just know the songs.
Mm-hmm. But you're seeing in the United States, the church in general is, and I define the church as anyone in an orthodox manner, whether they're a mainline church or and we have far more evangelical, non denominationally aligned churches in this
Mm-hmm.
country than you would have in Great Britain for sure. But anywhere in that range are going to be far more supportive of Donald Trump than not. But you are hearing a lot of frustration
Mm-hmm.
with the church. I've got friends who share my political viewpoints and I've actually worked with
Mm-hmm.
on political efforts, some of whom are pulling out of politics, by the way, because they're getting so frustrated. But they're very anti-Trump. And that's starting to grow a little bit in the church community
Mm-hmm.
in this country. Of course, now in the United States, mainline denominations are far more politically progressive
Yes, I've noticed that.
than
Yeah.
they are in Europe, I think, in some ways,
Well,
when they're
yeah,
traditionalist.
the kind of your Episcopalian churches are definitely super progressive, and there are the progressive wing. Like I guess over here, if you think of the Church of England, which is I guess our equivalent, and the Church of Ireland, their leadership may be heading in a more progressive way, but the sort of everyday person may be more conservative than leadership would suggest. So it's kind of I'm not
Right.
really sure. It's quite a broad church, I think, and quite literally a
Yeah.
broad church in that kind of our equivalent, the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
But most other denominations, I say, would be fundamentally conservative in their outlook. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because progressives in this country are finding a home in these more traditionalist mainline
Mm.
denominations. Um, they're actually those churches in this country are seeking to reach those people. They were more in the forefront of the homosexual marriage movement, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Even though I know those denominations on your side of the pond have been that way somewhat too, but there hasn't been as
Yes.
much
Yeah.
unanimity there in the lay people as there has been here in the United
Mm-hmm.
States in those mainline denominations. It is kind of interesting, and some of the theological implications of a lot of this here in the United States. I think that there is a strong movement, and I call myself in part of this movement to work to maintain what I would perceive as theological purity
Mm.
on some of these social issues, but also on these economic issues.
Mm.
I think, though, on both sides of the aisle, the church tends to be far less capitalistic than some would perceive, even in this country. I
Yeah.
think there's a real confusion in the church about these ideas of economics that where I find my home with Hayek and von Mises
Mm-hmm.
and Milton Friedman
Yeah.
here in the United States. I don't see the church on either side of
Mm.
the pond
No, I don't think so.
inspired by
Yeah,
that.
I don't think so. I think, well, yeah, there's definitely this confusion, and I think I've talked to people about this before. This confusion of it's that libertarianism, I guess, in ways you could say, or more liberal kind of viewpoints in terms of less intervention, less direct government intervention. I was talking to the guys from the Libertarian Christians Institute recently, and they had this conversation about this being perceived as a nasty or mean-spirited kind of theology where you don't want to help other people, but people, I think, maybe don't understand that very rarely will these points of view come about from a place of we're just pure greedy and don't want to help people. Generally, it's because they think that's the best way to help others, is to promote this kind of capitalist and free market viewpoint. And maybe, I think that's definitely misunderstood, where people think that just results to pure greed, and people who don't want to see the government intervene and just almost hand money to people. This kind of idea of a universal basic income, I guess, is the epitome of all this, really, where people think the government should just basically hand people their paycheck, and that's the fairest way to do it. But I don't think people understand that people who aren't for that, it's not because they're greedy, it's because they think it's the best thing for people.
Yeah. In fact, I would argue that there's no place in Scripture where a government is commanded to meet the needs of welfare. I would say actually here in the United States, and I would say also in Great Britain as well, governmentally, that government has a monopoly over philanthropy.
Right.
I mean, there's still philanthropy that happens outside of that nexus, but it's actually, I think most people through their taxes are looking to government to fulfill their needs of philanthropy, rather than hearing the scriptural command that you individually are called to care for the poor, to meet the need of the person who comes from another country. That is an individual command I see throughout Scripture, and that's one of the interesting dynamics of the way that the church, I think, perceives government action.
Well, this has been a huge theme on our blog since it's been started, where I've seen it's come from a number of contributors, and especially in discussions. I had a recent interview with Anne Widdecombe, who was really, I guess you could say, one of the top three guys, she's a woman, but one of the top three people in charge of the Brexit party, really, or one of the most prominent figures. She said the exact same thing, where it's this idea that people think the government providing these kinds of programs and starting up all these different philanthropic kind of programs and ideas, that this somehow abdicates you from your responsibility to help others, and it basically is it's outsourcing your charitable kind of giving, and it's outsourcing that kind of whole aspect of faith to the government. And I think that's definitely a huge issue, really, or presents a huge issue theologically, because I don't really see that there's a moral benefit really to sort of withdrawing from getting your hands dirty. I don't really see that it's really equivalent morally to say someone else can do that for me and that I don't have to do it. I've paid my taxes, that I am content that the poor is being taken care of and all these things because of the government. I don't know if that really, I just don't get it myself. I couldn't really be on board with that viewpoint.
Yeah, I think it's fair for a lot of Christians to look at these more libertarian-minded movements, however it's styled in Europe or here. My big beef with the Libertarian Party here, with whom I largely agree when it comes to economic principle, but I've often said that the big problem with the Libertarian Party here in the United States is the way they act. You would think that their whole philosophy and mission statement was, if we can make drugs and prostitution legal, then we'll all be free. I mean, that's kind of substantively, it really comes across that way. And I think it's more critical, so areas like drugs or whatever. I mean, I think we've had a real criminal justice problem in this country by making it, by putting so much emphasis on putting people in jail just for possessing drugs, as opposed to, being aggressive at people who actually undertake violent activities or activities where they steal and harm from others. And a restitutional form of justice is really what we need anywhere. I think that's really more God's plan than just, we don't like your behavior, so therefore we're going to. So I'm on board with that concept in liberty, but I believe capitalism, or at least, and it's hard to use that word because
Yeah, so
so
tainted.
filled with
Yeah.
political stuff, both from the Marxist perspective and from the libertarian perspective. But capitalism is the best way to have people fulfill what actually most of the moral commands of God. I mean, because I think when you like, I would say that I had a radio show in Denver for 4 years before I went to work in Congress in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And I would constantly talk about, if you're just the greediest jerk in the world and you want to be a billionaire, what do you have to do? No, you have to have a product that people want.
Yep.
You have to keep updating that product by talking to them. You have to have employees who deliver that product well or manufacture it well or service or whatever. You got to treat them well.
Yeah,
I mean, if you really want to be wealthy, you know.
Not easy to be
Yeah,
mean.
so that's right. And so all along the way in the process, you got to keep going back to your employees and to your customers and say, what do you need? And ultimately, if you even if you remain the greediest bastard in the world, you know, you've got to follow the golden rule to get wealthy. And again, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's pretty close to perfect. Yeah, because that's ultimately at the end what the capitalist system does. It values people who perform for others as opposed to performing for themselves. Whereas the perception is that the capitalist is greedy and taking advantage of others.
Yeah, like you said, it's impossible to get rich quick, really, anywhere in a capitalist society. It's just, whereas in a socialist world, you know, you just have to know the right people and be connected in that way. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist in some ways in a capitalist world, but
yeah, it can, of course.
Really, in order to rise to the top, really, you have to make people want to work for you, because you know they have to have some degree of loyalty, really, for you to do well. So people need to be loyal to your product. They need to think it's good enough to be worth coming back to. People need to want to come into work the next day and not just quit and go to work somewhere else. They have to have the right sort of conditions. And I think people often think, you know, ideas like the minimum wage are ways to guarantee that workplaces have the right conditions and are fair to their employees. But really, that's just setting kind of like a lowest common denominator. Like it's saying you can go this low rather than saying you have to be this high, because realistically, if people weren't happy with the wages they're being paid, they wouldn't take the job in the first place. So
if it's a free society where they can actually make that choice, and that's the fundamental aspect of a capitalist society, is that the worker and the producer or the capitalist all have the ability to make choices. And to be candid, workers can become capitalists if they work hard enough.
Absolutely.
I think that's a fundamentally biblical principle in my mind. And I think it's so difficult to hear Christians so often talk about the injustices and inequities of free market systems, and it's like you're not asking all the right questions. There are injustices and inequities. I mean, hello, we live in a fallen world. There's no way to escape that. As I say, 6,000 years of recorded human history proves the moral depravity of man. You're not going to get away from that construct, which is also biblical and clearly stated. But they don't want to ask questions about, okay, so we see greed in this capitalist, but do you ever see government greed? I mean, this recent revelation on Joe Biden, as we're just in the run-up to the November 3rd election, where he was working with his family and using his position as vice president to rake in literally billions of dollars into his family. And, of course, plausible deniability, you know, they're doing all the work, but it's coming to me through them. Listen, this kind of greed is very real. I mean, is there a socialist society that's not greedy? As you mentioned, if you want to get rich quick in a socialist society, well, get connected to the government and steal from people.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So Margaret Thatcher used to have, you know, the great saying when people talked about the gap between the richest and the poorest in society. You know, she would say that, you know, if people who are advocates for socialist systems, you know, they would rather that, for example, that the poor be here and the rich be here, rather than you know, the poor being here and the rich being higher. You just, you know, they're more concerned about
the gap. It all lifts up.
Rather than you know, people being so, like the gaps in society being so small. You'd rather, you know, people were higher and there'd be a bigger gap. You know, that's just maybe the way I think that's the fairer way for things to work themselves out, because really really in the socialist world. You have sort of the poor, and then the rich, and then the leaders that are just off the chart. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't. It's funny how that happens in communist and socialist countries where the gap
Yeah.
is enormous. You know, you would think they would be the systems where there would be no gap at all. And Marx obviously talked about the kind of falling away of the state in the end, but human nature makes that impossible in my eyes for this utopian society where people are completely
Yeah.
obsessed with making sure everyone's taken care of. Like, I just don't see that happening. And I think capitalist thought maybe provides the best construct for the greedy and the people who are truly selfish to be restricted from exploiting others. You know, I think that's capitalism means that if you're purely interested in yourself, you won't really get anywhere unless you're like we said, you're super well connected. But you mentioned your time in Congress, obviously. Do you want to tell people who are listening just a little bit about your background and who you are really, and what sort of inspired you to get involved in the political world, just really for my listeners who don't know you yet?
Well, I came to Christ as a 16-year-old in 1981, and it was a pretty radical transformation for me. I was a lost young kid, and it changed my entire perspective. I mean, it was a real conversion experience. Mm-hmm. You know, there are a lot of people that have a problem delineating that sometimes, and in some cases because they never really came to Christ at all. But in many cases, just, you know, they were working through a lot of things in life and trying to figure it all out. Mm-hmm. For me, it was very dramatic. And I was already in a family. My dad had, at his height, 103 fast food restaurants in Indiana, Ohio, wow, Kentucky, and West Virginia. And he was passionate about politics, even though he never got involved in it himself. We sat and watched the TV, and I heard him grousing about, you know, all that was going on. But he had really good insights and wisdom as to what was happening. So that kind of laid a foundation. But when I came to Christ, and as I said, this whole moral majority thing was coming, I was very concerned about the issue of abortion and about moral issues. I was delving a little bit into this economic perspective of what's just and free, but I was coming from a pure constitutionalist perspective as well, because I was in school. I was studying the Constitution. I was very interested in it. And I was also very interested in the moral foundations of our country. I learned that the United States really did have a moral foundation. I think there's an argument about it because it's often touted by people in the evangelical right here that we were founded as a Christian nation. I don't know that that's actually a really easy and clear thing to lay out there, but no doubt we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles.
I think so.
In fact, the ideas of the natural law, which really were first well codified through St. Thomas Aquinas, and were alluded to and discussed to some extent by Augustine. I think there is a Christian and moral foundation. I mean, Aquinas's arguments for the existence of God and his arguments for the natural law were fundamental to Western jurisprudence, Western idealism when it came to the formation of governments. All of this I was taking in as a young person. First, I went to an elite private high school in Tennessee called the Webb School. That's where I came to Christ. And then I ended up at Indiana University. And I'm grappling with these things, and I'm starting to deal so both in the political end and on the philosophical end. I was an English major at Indiana University. So I'm really thinking about these things. Along the way, my passion for politics was there. I got involved in campus political activity at Indiana University. But then later on in 1992, I'm sitting in our current Vice President Mike Pence's office in Indianapolis. He was running the Indiana Policy Review at the time. And we had some connections. He was from Columbus, Indiana, about an hour or so south of Indianapolis. But he was living on the south side of Indianapolis, which is where I grew up.
Right.
I always tell people I'm from Indianapolis. We run a little race there you might have heard of.
Yep.
And which is a great joke all around the world. It doesn't just work here. But so anyway, we're talking, and I told him, you know, I feel like I need to get involved in the political realm. And so he was meeting a guy right after me who gave me my first political job, a guy named George Whitwer. He ended up running for governor. I ended up running his gubernatorial campaign in 96. But prior to that, I was running state legislative campaigns. He had an organization that was supporting state legislative candidates. So that kind of got me involved in full-time politics. And I worked as a consultant. I did various things here and there, but I mostly worked as a consultant until 2005, when I went to work for Focus on the Family. For those in the United States, they know who Dr. James Dobson is. Some people in Europe might or might not know about him, but basically his ministry actually did a lot of real ministry work, helping women in crisis pregnancies, providing ultrasounds as a way to encourage to get into these crisis pregnancy centers, and as a way to encourage women to come in and not get the abortion, keep the child. They did other ministry too, philanthropically, but they had a portion where Dr. Dobson was very concerned about where we were going as a country politically and how Christians could rightly be involved in a biblical way. So I worked in the public policy department at Focus on the Family. It was set up as not the typical nonprofit organization, but that could do political activity. And I was involved with that. But I went into consulting and I went on the radio. I was doing work around the country. And I ended up, a gentleman named Tim Hillscamp, who had become a friend of mine many years hence, had won a congressional race. Mm-hmm. And in 2010, I was trying to help him find a chief of staff. I was connected in D.C., and I just wanted him to get someone that could really help him out. Nothing really worked, and he asked me to be his chief of staff. So I ended up in Washington from late 2010 until 2014. And I left and came back to Colorado. I was focused on the families based in Colorado. I moved here in 2005. But I came back to Colorado in 2014, was doing work around here, doing consulting work. And then Congressman Thomas Massey from Kentucky asked me to be his chief of staff. So I went back for a couple more years. I'm now back in Colorado. We live in Woodland Park, Colorado. I'm actually on the city council here in Woodland Park.
Wow, yeah.
But I'm still, through all these years of things that I've done, I know a lot of people in the White House right now working in the Trump administration who are friends of mine. Kellyanne Conway, who was his advisor, is a really good friend of mine. I've just found myself, and the Lord has put me in to the political realm where no one is going to doubt that I am a born-again Christian and committed to walking with Jesus Christ. But I don't wear it on my shoulder, but there's no way you're not going to know who I am. And so early on, in those early days when I started getting interested in politics, I spent a lot of time in prayer before God, just thinking through what am I supposed to do in this? What does a Christian do in this dirty, nasty business? I mean, it really is dirty and nasty, I'm telling you. I worked at Indiana Family Institute with a guy named Bill Smith. It was a pro-family organization in Indiana. Bill eventually became Mike Pence's chief of staff when he was in Congress and is still a close political advisor to the vice president today. But Bill taught me something very valuable. He said, listen, if you're going to be a Christian working in politics and trying to move political action, you're going to have to maintain your moral character, which means you're going to have to work harder than anyone else because you can't do moral shortcuts. These moral shortcuts exist throughout politics. Ronald Reagan always said that politics is the world's second oldest profession, and it's very much like the oldest one. Which is prostitution, by the way, for people who don't know that.
For anyone in doubt,
and that takes a lot of effort as a Christian believer. You have to work harder. You have to be better at what you do. But I will tell you, so as I've worked through politics all these years, what I understood in working harder was that you also have to stop being so nice and stop catering to everyone. There's a place where you read, for example, Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is back to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. Well, I'm going to tell you, he was a sharp guy. He was very dedicated and devoted, but he certainly, when Sanballat and those were coming against him, he obviously opposed those guys. But his harshest words were for the people working on the wall. He wasn't just being nice to them and, oh, okay, well, I know it's so tough for you. He's like, no, put up your freaking shields and the rest of you get on the wall and get working. This was serious to him. And I believe that if the Christian, as it relates to politics, should not at all be nice. Nice is a very selfish thing. It's what's pleasing to me, what really is acceptable to me. What we should do is undertake God's commanded characteristic of kindness, which is always looking to the benefit of others. And I always say, so this is why I call my podcast Against Nice.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
I say on one side, the parent who is not disciplining their child cannot be considered very kind, but the child being disciplined never thinks it's very nice.
Right. Yeah, so exactly.
We need to have this thought of kindness, which will cause us to speak out in society. And I use Nehemiah as an example, but there are many others in Scripture where this example is there. Not perfect people. I mean, David was a man after God's own heart and probably committed worse sins than any major character in the Bible, at least that we know about. And so it's not about personal perfection. It's about understanding God's justice. And so Micah 6:8 is the fundamental scripture that I look to when I talk about this. He, God, has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does he require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Justice is a serious issue. Yep. And if we're going to stand for God's justice as he sees it, not as we see it, then that's going to require difficult conversations in the society. But kindness is going to bring us back around, where if we're promoting this justice, we're also not trying to do it in our own way, but in God's way, and with the thoughtfulness of others. Jesus, it is said of him in the New Testament, never harmed a broken reed. But he did call the Pharisees a brood of vipers. Yeah. There is a brood of vipers out there that we need to call out. They're usually the Christians, by the way, or the people of faith, but there are others too. And then to walk humbly with your God. We need to entirely undertake an attitude of humility. In fact, I had young people working for me when I was in Washington, D.C., very young. Most staffers are 30 and less. And I would always tell them, you need to have an attitude, frankly, of humiliation. This is the way I talk about it. You need to be willing to be humiliated, because the quickest way to fix a problem is to admit it immediately. And that requires humiliation. And I think we need that, Christians that have these attitudes in them involved in the political realm, whether they're an MP in London or whether they're a congressman in Washington, D.C., or a state legislator here in our states. This is really important.
Just
we need more people like
yourself,
this. But yet be firm and yet be a fighter for what matters.
Yeah, so I guess naturally, following on from what you said, I think it's amazing, and I think the vision really is a very... You obviously have a very clear vision. I think it's a great one. Some people might say then, for example, this is one of the biggest topics of discussion, I think, for believers today, that and we've seen John Piper talking about it. We're currently recording about a week before the election. I think I'm going to release this a little later. So for anyone listening, this is the context. So John Piper said basically that this idea of someone who speaks in ways that are coarse or vulgar or maybe not as polished, that's as grave a sin really as the policy side of things. And when people hear maybe Against Nice and that you're a conservative, does that mean that does that mean that you support perhaps Donald Trump's style of being what some could say is definitely not nice, mean, maybe derogatory in some ways, but he gets things done? What's your opinion on that side of things?
I think I've described that a little bit in the concept as I've shared it so far, but I do believe that some aspects of what Donald Trump does are absolutely within the wheelhouse of the Christian. I have deep respect for John Piper. I mean, he and I are obviously on the same page when it comes to Reformed theology. I'm 100% with him. I think he's one of the most fantastic and clear-thinking pastors and theologians in the world. My personal favorite is R.C. Sproul of Ligonier Ministries. I mean, he's like the best in my mind. But I love what John Piper has to say and how he approaches ministry, pastoral ministry in particular, and theology in general. I think what happens for Christians, and this is why I call it against nice, not because we need to be jerks,
Right.
be unkind, be, have it. There was this one congressman I knew, of the many that I know, who woke up every single day and said to himself, how can I screw leadership today? Now, I don't think that's the way a Christian needs to be doing politics. By the way, John Brown, who was really the instigator, historically, one would say, of our movement of the Civil War and getting rid of the slavery in this country, was a jerk. He claimed Christ.
Mm-hmm.
The guy was really mean. And I think that there was something providential God was doing here in the United States at that time and through him in some ways. But do I think that people need to be that way? No, I don't think that that's the answer. But we do need to be purposeful. We need to recognize that if we're going to stand for true justice, we are going to be ostracized in society. And that means people are going to perceive us like they perceive Donald Trump. I'm not certain that every tactic that Donald Trump uses is always the best one. Yeah. So I'm not saying that he's the person to mimic, but the way I oppose what John Piper is saying is that I think we ask a lot of times in the church all the wrong questions. So the question is not, we were never in Scripture commanded to be perceived as nice or thoughtful, or kind. Quite the opposite. You look at Paul in Athens on Mars Hill. You look at Paul in front of some of the main leaders of the time as he was going up to the place where he was imprisoned and ultimately killed. You look at Stephen in Acts when just before he's stoned, and the things that he said to the Jewish leaders at that time. Our goal is not perception of kindness and niceness. Our goal
is the works and the fruit.
That's right. And when you go into Micah 6:8, that word to love kindness, which also some translate as loving kindness, that's the Hebrew word chesed. Very difficult to translate into English, but a very critical word in the Old Testament. The desire, and this is why I say that kindness is thinking of the benefit of others. That is not connected to their perception of you benefiting them. It's connected to God's justice, God's personality, who he is. One of the great things that we've lost in the church, in Western culture, and maybe in other places around the world in other cultures, is that the undertaking of theology is lost. In other words, the study of God. We spend a whole lot of time thinking about how we can be blessed, what our prayer life can be like, whether we're holy and pious. All these things are important, but in and of themselves, unless you are seeking God's righteousness, you're not there. And the only way to get there is to know who he is.
Dwelling in the word really is what you're sort of saying there. Just people maybe neglect that side of things, and really the study of God's character through the word and through all of Scripture that we've and we maybe take that for granted, having this resource available to us that sort of lists all. It's just a complete directory of God's character from start to finish. So I think that's very easily neglected. And so you mentioned obviously that you are familiar with a lot of people in the White House, and you're friendly with a lot of them and connected to them. When people say, I actually saw this today, that Trump's White House is kind of very clearly not catered towards helping people, and it's more as a selfish kind of an administration. From your experience of the people that that are involved, do you doubt at all their intentions are good, or do you trust the people that Donald Trump has around him in his administration?
For the most part, now that kind of some of the people that were working against him have been weeded out, the answer is yes. I think that in the sense you're talking about, Donald Trump gets a negative rap because he's falling more fundamentally into these principles of liberty that I think are absolutely important, and that Christians should accept. Listen, I don't want Christians to become libertarians, okay, in the sense that we understand that word, because some people are, as I talked about earlier, if sex and prostitution and drugs are legal, then we'll all be free, I think is not the biblical way of looking things. But there is a principle of liberty, and I think it should have political consequences as well, that Christians should understand from Scripture. God's commands are to us individually to help others. So most of this negativity that comes against the Trump administration, I'm taking the man a little bit out of the picture, talking about the administration as a whole, is that there is an attempt there in most areas of his administration, not all, to reassert constitutional principles. And that looks hateful to a lot of people. Even some Christians look at it that way, because they've got it in their mind that if the government's not doing something, then we've got a problem. I will tell you that attitude that you talk about is a misrepresentation of the White House. But let me double down on that, because having worked on Capitol Hill and in Republican politics, I am either acquainted with or know pretty well most of the Republican congressmen there, and most of them that claim Christ. And I'm going to tell you this, most of those guys vote like Satan, because they believe that we need to take government action to assert these things that are of a Christian character that we're concerned about as Christians. To the contrary, you should be preaching that in society. You should be showing it in society. That's where it gets done. You can't get it done by government. And I think Christians are lazy about leaving all that to government.
Yeah, well, you'll never convince anyone by forcing them to do something. You just make them resentful. And I guess in Northern Ireland, this was a big issue because we held out for so much longer than the rest of the UK on the gay marriage and abortion type issues. And I think both of them are now legally covered in Northern Ireland, but for a long time we were the only part of the UK that we provided civil unions and things like that, but we didn't provide for gay marriage as a state-supported, state-sanctioned idea. And part of me, I have my views as a Christian, but, you wonder, does that do much more harm than good to compel people that, they have to get on a plane to fly to England to get married to someone who is of the same sex as they are? And whether you agree with that, I think is your own choice. But I think that's that sort of approach where you make people inherently resentful of the powers that be, and especially because the DUP is such an overtly Christian party. At least that's what they claim. A lot of it, their formation and their background is obviously, for me in Paisley, like I said, was a church minister. So they're an overtly Christian party. But I think that caused a huge amount of resentment towards people of faith, just because of this idea that they want to tell us what to do. They want to force us to do all these things. And I think it worked against the church in the end. And I would be very sort of cautious about any government system where you sort of set that up to tell people what they can and can't do on, these kind of social issues. And drugs is one that I struggle with. Like you said, it's a tough one because, and prostitution, those kind of things, they're all tough issues, but I guess they have to be viewed through the lens of what in the end is, number one, what is good for society and what's good for, I guess, your witness as a Christian, and what's good for spreading the gospel more. If you restrict people's access to, and obviously abortion's a very different issue to gay marriage, but if you restrict people's access to gay marriage, then is that going to really benefit the building of the church and the furthering of the gospel in the end? Because at the end of the day, as long as the church isn't being forced to condone it themselves, does it matter what the state does? It's not, the state is not the church and is not the sort of apparatus of the kingdom, really. So it's a separate institution. So should you be that concerned about what they recognize? So it's very difficult, to see these issues and work them out in terms of what we should intervene in and what we shouldn't. But do you have a rule of thumb really when deciding where where to draw the line on this is something that we can legislate on and should be legislating on, and these are things that we can leave to people to their own choice?
Yeah, it's interesting. Homosexual marriage became legal in this country by means of the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision. My disagreement with that is constitutional. They argued for homosexual marriage to be legal on constitutional grounds. There are no constitutional grounds, one way or the other, related to what the definition of marriage is. And I personally think that should be a state-by-state decision, and I was supportive of a constitutional amendment to define marriage as one man and one woman in this country. Now, if we took that constitutional process, then that would be appropriate. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I will say this. I have been arguing that, and I don't know how marriage in the church is in Europe. I don't, I just culturally am not connected well enough there to understand. I'm more culturally connected with India, where I've been quite a bit,
right?
But I haven't seen it in operating on a day-to-day basis in Europe because I haven't been there a lot. But I can tell you how marriage operates in this country, and the church, and it's not very good. To be candid, statistically, we're just as bad as the rest of society, and in some areas maybe a little bit worse when it comes to issues like divorce, adultery, all these moral components of marriage. And I've said very publicly, the reason we have homosexual marriage in this country is not because of homosexual activists. It's because of the Christians. We suck at marriage in this country. We're really bad. In fact, we have so many heretical ideas related to marriage, and we don't go back to Scripture. From a political and governmental point of view, I don't see the utility of government making marriage better. I would be fine if we had no marriage laws in this country,
right? Yeah,
and then Christians made their own marriage laws with one another and held themselves accountable. That's the way it was for a long period of time, and I think we do such a poor job. You know, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century BC wrote his apology to Antonius Pius of the then Roman emperor. And he didn't write an apology saying, I'm sorry, we're so bad. No, this was his argument for, as Peter said, you need to make a defense of the faith. That's the Greek word apologia. Justin Martyr's apology, which was a defense of the church and of Christian teaching, he was able rightly to argue to the Roman emperor that, look, we follow the laws. We do the things that we're supposed to do. We pay our taxes. We go out into the woods, this was the form of abortion at the time. We go out into the woods and we save those children that were thrown out to the elements, and we raise them and we teach them to be good citizens as well. I do not believe someone like Justin Martyr could make that argument for the character of the church in this day and age. Justin Martyr rightly could then. I think judgment begins in the house of God. We have a lot of work to do as Christians. So in one sense, I promote that we need to be out there in the political sphere making arguments, particularly in this country where, our Constitution starts, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Not the government to form a perfect union for the people, but the other way around. Christians in this society should be making political arguments, should get involved at whatever level is appropriate for them. I'm not saying everyone needs to get elected and all this kind of stuff, but they do need to vote, and they do need to tell their friends about these principles, because this government was founded by the people. I mean, that's a little bit different in Great Britain. The government founded the government in Great Britain, if we're really honest about it. That's one interesting difference between us. Now, you do it in a way that is right and gives authority and rights to the people. But ours was literally founded that way. So I'm not saying, though, that we need to become all politicians, because on the other side of that, we need to be really good in the church. I was going to mention earlier this whole idea of Micah 6:8. It's interesting. God's the center of his word. He's the center of worship for the Christian, for the believer. He is the center of all things because he created all things. But my one beef with Hillsong and what's their faces in Redmond?
Bethel.
Bethel,
Redding,
thank you. Is sometimes that their worship songs are all about me, right? They're not about God. the beauty of the hymns is they are praise to God. They theologically repeat who God is and his character. My wife Meyer and I are starting to go to a new church, and we've gotten to know this pastor. He's a good guy. And I went into their worship service a couple weekends ago, and at the end I said, it's just really nice to be in a worship service that's not all about me.
Yeah.
That's about God.
Yeah.
I think we miss that in the church.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of work and a lot of hymns and music that Bethel have written that I really do like.
That are great.
Yeah, there's obviously each person has to discern, and especially I was involved as in worship in our church, so I was involved in kind of deciding in ways which of these are beneficial to the church, and some of them,
right.
I tended to stay away with a lot of the ones that are just kind of saying the word good 10,000 times, those kind of ones that maybe I like the ones with a little bit more meat, but again there's a lot of ones that maybe were more simple. And funnily enough,
right.
this reminds me of another topic that maybe we could briefly talk on, because I know we've been going on for a while and I don't want to keep you too long, but this whole idea of Sean from Bethel and the kind of let us worship thing, and this, I'm sure you've seen the kind of, I guess you could say, protests around the nation where he's kind of going around, and especially in DC at the minute with these larger kind of worship events. Do you have any opinions on that? Because a lot of people make the same argument of the church should be maybe more caring and considerate of those who, spreading this virus that could kill people. And I see both sides of the argument as fair. I think that he perhaps goes above and beyond maybe what I would, in terms of the crowds are very organic and just people are there praising with less consideration of the health aspects. But I do understand as well that people who love their life will lose it. People who love this life and are so obsessed with perhaps and this is the thing as well. No one's forcing anyone to go out. If people are vulnerable, they should stay at home. If they're not comfortable, they should totally stay at home. But I think as well, people forget this idea of worship above all else and serving God above all else. And if people are getting healed and saved, then surely it has to be a good thing, even if there is some small risk of catching a fairly, it's not a severe disease in terms of, yes, there's a lot of people dying, but
for the vast majority
it's a fairly mild illness. So what's your opinions on that? I'm sure you've seen it on social media.
He actually went down the hill from here in Woodland Park down to Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. He did a worship thing. I was unable to go to it. I was planning to be candid. Mm-hmm. So we know statistically right now about this, that 99.97% chance for people under 40 to survive this. You go above 40, it's 99.98. Okay. And then you get into this 70 and older, you're talking about 99.5%. Mm-hmm. So where's the risk? The risk is with older people. It's not with younger people. And I believe I had the disease. I need to get tested for antibodies. I haven't done it yet, but I'm convinced that my wife and I both got it in February. The way we got the flu and that we were sick, we're pretty certain that that's what it was. But so in this country, we have never, ever, ever, ever shut down large swaths of our economy because of a virus and a disease. The Spanish flu, both in Europe and here, was horrible in 1918, 19, and 20. Horrible. And people were dying. We didn't shut down the country. We did do isolation, right? And that's appropriate in this. Mm-hmm. So my philosophy on all this, both from a Christian perspective and from a political one, is that what you do is make sure the information is excellent from the scientists, that it is not political. But when you go and shut down a country, and this applies to Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or any other world leader, when you go to shut down a country, you make the science political of necessity, because those scientists have to meet the requirements that the political leaders give them. Yeah. Scientists don't have authority in this country to shut things down. That's the political leader's decision. And it's so hard to constitutionally,
discern. It's really hard to discern, what is political, what is purely health-based. And people say we should go totally by what the health guys say, but then, you do tend to neglect what happens to the person who loses their whole livelihoods. And, I couldn't even imagine. That ruins lives, literally, almost in a worse way in some cases, because instead of, maybe instead of a death, then you have poverty and even suicide, things like that. So people tend to neglect that. But yeah, it's hard to decipher, what is all political talk and what is the scientific advice, on the health front.
Well, put it in this context. No bureaucrat in Great Britain or the United States lost their job over this virus.
Mm-hmm.
Consider that for a second.
Yeah.
But millions of people lost their jobs. Some, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have permanently lost their small businesses. You talked about in Wales that the large grocery stores were closed in favor of the small ones. That's pretty good, and it's unique. I know that here in the United States, all the big box stores like the Walmarts and the Targets and some of these large concerns that we have, they didn't shut down. The small businesses were shut down.
Yep.
The restaurant industry in this country, in some areas of it, is nearly decimated. It's probably the same there too.
Hotels,
London's not going to be the
here,
same. New York City's not going to be the same. You both cities that have great restaurant services, they're half gone, and they're never coming back, or at least not in the short run.
This is a huge fear for me, because having visited New York, I think it's one of the most amazing places on earth, that I've been to. And, politics aside, it's like a place really that's like no other.
Right.
And I'm worried that my wife's never been, and that the New York that we end up going to won't be the New York that I saw maybe 2016, I think I was there. And I just worry what will be left of these cities. How long will it take for the recovery? And, is the government making it worse in some ways?
Yeah. Listen, how many pubs are going to be left in London or in Manchester or even up in Northern Ireland, anywhere in Northern Ireland?
The hotels.
So many of them are gone.
Well, yeah. Hotels closing.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So it was absolutely unnecessary. The way you deal with things like this is great information that's not tied to any political effort. All these politicians that illegally, frankly, in this country, based on our laws, shut down these states. They didn't go to the legislature. It wasn't a legislative vote. And in this country, the legislature votes for this stuff.
Right.
You don't have a king or a queen, so to speak. And so this has been horrible that way. Every Christian should be up in arms about it, but so many Christians are compliant. By the way, churches were treated worse in this country than businesses. One of the great examples, and the Supreme Court ruled, in my opinion, against the religious liberties laid out in the First Amendment in this country. There was a church in Las Vegas that was limited to, or churches in Las Vegas were limited to 50 people, but casinos were allowed to have 50% occupancy.
Yep.
And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the governor with that policy. Seriously, you got a church of 1,000. You got a few churches there that have 500 to 1,000 or more members that were limited to 50 people, but the casinos were half filled.
Same with
crazy.
John MacArthur's church is a prime example as well. And again, it divides opinion a lot, and I think that there are good arguments on both sides. Of people that are for it and against it. But to me, I totally understand when people want to continue to worship and are willing to take that risk. I think that should be something that is allowed to happen, and people can't be restricted from doing that. But whether people should is another question. That's for each person to decide themselves. But the fact that the government would tell people this is too risky, you don't stop people skydiving, you don't stop people driving down the highway where there's probably a greater chance in some ways of getting hit or totaling your car and dying than there is of catching the disease and dying from it. But yeah, I think that freedom has to prevail in these circumstances where people are divided. You have to rule on the side of allowing people to make their own choices, especially just where people are not sure which way to go. Just go with freedom and allow people to decide themselves. Let it. Well,
and on the other side of this debate here, you've got people who are all for freedom and agree with me that the government shouldn't be shutting down stuff. But as Christians, sometimes even they're out telling people how horrible they are for requiring masks in their business. No, you don't do that either.
Yeah.
Listen, if a business or a church or any institution wants to require masks, wants to require social distancing in their private business or in their church that's not run by the government, which we have none of here. You have a little bit of there to some degree.
Yeah,
it's not
the Queen's technically the head of the Church of England. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, let them make a good decision and then honor them for making that. That's what a free society is about. Even if they're too highly restrictive, they're going to pay a price or survive in the marketplace. That's the beauty of freedom. And so I think that, that's the other side of this issue where in this country, people are really nasty at others for wearing a mask or requiring a mask in their business. It's like, get over it. Let them decide. But the government should not be deciding, in my opinion, both from a Christian perspective and generally a political perspective. I don't think it's the government's to decide. Great information. In Calvin's 5 points of Calvinism, you talk about the moral depravity of man. Well, he doesn't use the term utter depravity, you'll notice. It's moral depravity. In other words, if we want to approach God, we don't have the opportunity. We are depraved in that sense. Romans 3 lays this out. Isaiah 64 lays this out. So many parts of Scripture make it very clear our moral incapability to approach God. But it doesn't mean that we are utterly morally depraved. So, Hitler loved Eva Braun and probably treated her well. That is maybe the most morally depraved man in human history, and still probably treated that woman with care as he's destroying the lives of others. So he should be obviously rebuked. But we're not utterly depraved as people. So therefore, if you give people good information, they're going to make a decision that may be self-interested in the sense I don't want to die, but they're going to tend to have some degree of thoughtfulness to others in a way, by the way, that Hitler never would. But this is something that free societies should understand, that man is not good by nature. He's actually wicked by nature, to be candid. He's going to do the selfish, self-interested thing, tend to do it. But when you have an organized society, he or she is required of necessity to think of others at some level, and some do it better than others. So we need to trust people to make good decisions if they have good information. And we didn't have either of those things in this outbreak at all. We did have it during the Spanish flu. The Hong Kong flu of the late 60s, in the America and in Europe. We didn't shut anything down in either place. People were living normally. Woodstock, the famous Woodstock, happened during the Hong Kong flu in upper state New York. So, we can still make decisions on our own and do pretty well with it. And we need to trust people to figure it out if we give them good info. Christians should be at the forefront of this understanding, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're just at a time where information is so ubiquitous that people can access, the instant to the minute almost death count. And I think this is it's almost risky. Like, I understand when people are criticizing Donald Trump for not being as open about it being dangerous, in order to prevent panic. But I see a lot of the virtue of that, because I think it's just the same as I saw people say about if you put like heart attacks related to obesity, or if you put up car crash deaths, those kind of things, people would start to freak out about those as well if they were seeing the numbers minute by minute. So there would be a movement to have a national speed limit of 30 or something like that, So it's this age of information, that's really, people have such quick access to things that will worry them, and without someone almost to take the lead and say there's no need to panic. Not that you may not succumb to this illness, but it's, we'll get through it with positivity and bring people together. And that, I think that's definitely a virtue. Sorry, go ahead.
So as we get close to shutting this down here, Josh, what do you see? Where do you see the church right now, and what do you see as the hope for the future as we try to grapple with these issues of religion and politics that we all tend to want to avoid?
I was talking to a political science professor who specializes in the areas of religion and politics, and I asked him a sort of similar question about, what position should the church be in terms of, or what would benefit the church most? How should we approach these issues that are divisive. And his advice really, or he wouldn't have used the word advice, but what he was saying is he tends to see churches as being promoters of values and of certain belief systems that, you know, the church really is, it's not the church's place to tell people what to do, but to promote certain values and lobby for those values. So rather than being involved specifically in endorsing particular political parties or political figures, he saw the church's place as being promoters of values and allowing people then to make that decision for themselves as to who best fits that value system and and allowing people to vote for themselves. So I understand his point of view. So I think really, in my opinion, what needs to happen is more dialogue and less assumptions of, like I said, in the UK, people assumed that everyone hates Trump, I think, and hates Brexit, and that caused divisions because people were then feeling like, I don't know if this church represents me. And I think every church is probably faced with similar issues on that front, and especially when they have a broad demographic. So I think where we need to be is in a place where we can have open discussions, but we don't look down on our fellow man for believing different things to us and for supporting different political objectives, political parties than us. And really, it comes down to discipleship and seeing people as your brothers, where if you feel like someone maybe is supporting something that's harmful, then take them aside, talk to them, learn from each other, and try to grow in that sense. But what I see too much of is the church being so strongly linked to particular ideologies, and I don't know if it'll ever stop, but I see in America there may be churches that are, I've seen it quite a lot actually, that are super, like they promote, for example, this idea of the state of Israel as being something they should really support, and not everyone believes that, but that drives some people away in certain regards. Whereas instead of talking about that, you know, talk scripture, talk values, or if your church supports Donald Trump, or if your church doesn't, if it hates Donald Trump and says this is something we should not be going near at all, not touching with a 10-foot pole, then you need to, instead of doing that, instead of saying that very clearly and like that, talk about the values and let people make their own minds up. And if people see Donald Trump as supporting their views and their values, then that's their decision. But the church shouldn't be looking down on people for that, because that's the worst, in my mind, the worst. The reason really I started these podcasts was to get rid of that. That sort of it's so pervasive, where people are looking down on people who disagree with them instead of engaging with them. So that would be my 2 cents. I think for me, it's about engaging, talking to people from all sides, and then letting people make their minds up and loving them no less for disagreeing with you.
Yeah, I believe that the church here in the United States, one of the big problems I have is that Jerry Falwell and Dr. Dobson, whom I worked for, Dr. James Dobson, D. James Kennedy, Charles Colson, Chuck Colson, these great leaders who have begin passing along here in the United States were very effective at getting Christians involved in the political endeavor. I think fundamentally that was a very good thing. Along the way, here in the United States, Christians became sometimes slavishly devoted to one political party or the other. You see this in general evangelical circles, black and white, and other races in the church for the Republican Party. You actually see this in a lot of the black community that are very conservative. I mean, they're wonderful believers in Christ, walking with Jesus, but sometimes slavishly devoted to the Democrat Party. I think that's actually going to be an interesting thing to watch after November 3rd. What the results of how the black community voted related to Biden and Trump. And I think there are going to be some, at least some modest shifts that'll make that an interesting discussion. But this slavish devotion to party is bad. Now, I'm going to continue to work in the Republican Party, even though philosophically I'm probably closer to the Libertarian Party in terms of activities, because that's just where I choose to work. But I have no slavish devotion to that party. And I think that's something we don't want to encourage Christians to do. But there are a set of principles. I think, by the way, we didn't get into this, and we can talk about it sometime in the future, hopefully, in 1 Samuel 8, the rebuke that God gave to Israel for wanting a king, I think lays out something very important that Christians need to study and be aware of. Because I believe God to be a limited government philosophically limited government for what we do in this world until he comes back and, until the eschatological things play out. But I think God is limited government. In fact, his biggest rebuke to Israel is they wanted to stop serving him and they wanted to serve a king instead. In fact, that's what he told Samuel when Samuel was so upset about it. God said, hey, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me.
Yeah.
And I think Christians need to work towards a society and government to the extent that they can influence it, where we are devoted to him.
Yes.
We're not devoted to some worldly ideology, but we are devoted to his ideologies, the things that he lays out in Scripture. And I think we need to be slavishly devoted to that. That's something that's very important that God lays out for us. And we need to understand his principles. I think we need to get back to studying theology and not worship or whatever stupid little thing that we devote ourselves to. I want to read this because I ran a marriage amendment effort in Colorado in 2006. And as I was praying through and knowing what I had to do, I went to the Lord told me I needed to memorize Psalm 4. Now, I'm not going to read it all here, but I just want to read a couple things here because I think that every Christian, when they think through politics and these cultural issues, needs to understand what God's saying here as a foundation.
Right.
Said, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. I'm reading the English Standard Version. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long will you will my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? By the way, this is the Christian speaking into culture, FYI. Doesn't always look nice and pretty. But he says, but know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. And I'm going to skip ahead to this part. There are many who say, who will show us any good? That is a question Christians are asking in society. And to be candid, they ought to know the answer to that. God is showing us good every single day. We need to live it out in our lives, example it to others. We need to assert it in culture and even in politics, in my opinion. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than when their grain and new wine abound. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell into safety. I really think Christians, first of all, when they think about these matters, should read Psalm 4. Consider the implications that we will go into a society that wants to defame us, that we need to not lose heart when it seems that the worldly culture is overwhelming us in any way. And we need to go into the culture not to become part of it. And this is some of my concern with the Christian church on both sides of the pond, to be candid, is that we feel like we got to be part of culture where we don't hate the homosexual. But then are we also going to give up that God considers homosexuality sin? We don't hate the person. We love the person. We honor them. We build relationships with them even. But we don't undertake honoring the sin. We need to get serious about what our role is in culture. And our role is to be faithful and truthful to who God is and what the requirements to us are. And then we need to example that into culture as best possible. And then be quite honest when we fail even. And yet, but we don't compromise the principles and the things that matter to him. That's a challenge because if we don't honor him, we're going to be accused of being mean and nasty, but yet we shouldn't purposefully be that way either. It's a real challenge, but we've got to think about this seriously. And it's my hope, and this is what I've tried to do in politics all my life, and I hope to continue to do as he gives me grace to do it. But we just need to think differently. It's time to change. And by the way, in this country, and I pray also in Europe, we need in this country a third great awakening. We had two great awakenings that radically transformed our culture and our way of thinking. It didn't mean everyone got saved and became a Christian, but we need this cultural reset. I think Europe needs it too. Europe has the foundations of Christian culture in it as well too. The Judeo-Christian ethic still is fundamentally at the core. Hopefully it won't be lost forever. And we need to reassert that and go back to it.
Amen. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jim, for taking the time to talk today. I mean, I appreciate your offer, and it's a blessing for me to be able to to be on your show as well as you being on mine. So thanks so much for reaching out, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your willingness to have me on too, and we should do this from time to time, especially as some of these big issues come up, because I think we've got a lot to talk about, and I think Christians really are hungry to know and especially understand what's going on
in the wake of the election. Who knows what's going to happen, but we can debrief that in a future time and some of the issues that we see from that. But I've really enjoyed it, and thanks so much again for that. Do you want to tell my listeners sort of where they can find your sites online, and are you on social media, those kind of things?
Yeah, so if you go, well, first of all, my website is politicsisn'tnice.com. That's the website for the Against Nice podcast. On Twitter, Against Nice. On Facebook, facebook.com/Against Nice. Those are the main areas that I am on, and tell people how to get to your place for folks listening to my podcast.
So our website, pretty much everything is on the website at www. I think I said 3 W's there. It almost sounded like I said more. www.thetwothings.org, I believe. So go on there, and all our links are there. And we're on Instagram at the Two Things Network, and we're on Twitter and Facebook and all those other places. So if you go to the website, it'll all be there, and you can get all of our links. And I think the podcast is available on Spotify as well, if anyone uses that. But YouTube is our main site, so you can search The Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About on YouTube. But like I said, the link will be on our website, and you can find it all on there.
And by the way, we're on YouTube as well. You've got some very interesting content. People will agree or disagree with some of it, but they're going to find it a great place to really grapple with politics and religion.
It's. I mean, I've had people from all different perspectives. From really strong conservatives, and even the conversation today is some conservative topics. Libertarians, people who don't necessarily engage with politics at all. People who are like I said, researchers and pastors, everything. So I encourage everyone to look into some of them. But even the people that you may disagree with, you'll learn something, I think. So I encourage everyone to pick almost the person that they disagree with the most, or think they might, and see what comes out of it. But I'm really looking for more actually Christian kind of liberals, and even people who may describe themselves as Christian socialists to come on and talk a little bit about why they got to where they are. So if anyone listening is in that boat, then give me a shout. But I think that would be an interesting conversation, because I want to challenge some of the things. I'm naturally more conservative. I want to hear the opposing viewpoint, and I think it's healthy to do that. But doesn't mean you'll come out agreeing with them. But it's all about the conversation and learning and letting God speak to both sides of the argument.
Totally agree that that's a healthy thing to do, and we should definitely be involved with it. And by the way, I want to encourage your listeners to, as you did, click on the podcasts link at the top of the page, and go to my original podcast where I talk about this Against Nice theory that I have. I also have a small article.
It's a great listen.
That does the same thing.
I can confirm that. Anyone from my side, definitely go to that page and listen, because you've touched on some of the things in this episode, but you go into obviously more detail on this philosophy. So I encourage everyone to go listen to that and support. We'll support each other's pages.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, I'm glad to have you on my podcast. I'm honored to be on yours as well.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And thanks so much, everyone, for listening. You can join us next week on the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. But thanks, Jim, for joining us. And for everyone listening, make sure you click like and subscribe if you enjoy, just so you can get the latest content when it comes out. But until next time, thanks so much for listening.